My name is Ed Chapman, and this video cast is going to cover the first part of our unit on genetics, which is Unit 9. And our first couple benchmarks in this unit are about the work of a scientist named Gregor Mendel and his ability to make predictions about potential offspring or offspring that haven't been born yet based on the genes or the traits found in the parents. And I'm going to assume that you guys don't know anything about this, although most of you probably were exposed a little bit to this in middle school. All right? Okay, before we can really get into Mendelian genetics, or the genetics of Mendel and his pea plants, we have to make sure you understand the difference between a genetic trait and a trait that's acquired, or a trait that you pick up in the course of your life, or that you learn. Genetic traits are traits that are strictly inherited by way of genetics, DNA that's passed from parents to offspring. These are things like eye color, skin tone, hair texture, and certain abilities. Acquired traits, on the other hand, are traits that you learn or that you pick up in the course of your life by way of cultural exposure, so to speak. Things like your language, the accent you speak with, your ability to ride a bike, your ability to write, your handwriting styles. All these things are traits that you learn. Mendel's work, or the work of genetics, is concerned primarily with the traits that are inherited genetically, or what we call genetic traits. Gregor Mendel was a 19th century monk. He was living in Austria in the 1800s, and he was a gardener, and he was growing pea plants. Now, pea plants come in many different varieties. The peas that most of us eat and grow here in the United States are round, smooth, green pea plants, but they do come in other colors and other shapes. And Mendel used these different varieties to study patterns of inheritance. And in the process of doing his research, he discovered some laws that govern the inheritance of genetic traits. And when you have a law in place, you can then make predictions. So why did he pick pea plants? Well, pea plants are very easy to grow, and they grow quickly. So you can get many generations in one season. And each generation of offspring has many seeds, because the babies or the offspring of pea plants are also known as seeds. The pollination, or the sexual reproduction of pea plants, is relatively easy to control. You can do it with a paintbrush. You just choose where you get the pollen from and where you take the pollen to, moving it from flower to flower, much like a pollinator or a bee would. Pea plants are also very cheap, and you can eat them when you're done if you like peas. Now, Mendel is considered to be the founder of the science of genetics, even though people have been interested in genetics for a very long time. People have noticed for thousands of years that kids look like their parents. But what are the rules governing which traits are passed on and which traits aren't? This is what geneticists do. They make predictions about future generations based on mathematics and observation, not just on what they believe or what they hope. Mendel came up with the idea of a gene, and a gene is a unit of a trait. Now, you guys already know that genes are built from DNA. They're stored in chromosomes, and chromosomes moving around inside the nucleus during cell division. Mendel had no idea about any of this, but he was looking at the idea of a gene from the point of view of a trait. And he noticed that traits came in different forms. And he used the word allele to describe the different forms of a trait. And he figured out that each trait is actually controlled by two different alleles, or a pair of alleles. So, for example, we can represent a pea plant, we'll call this the female pea plant because she's going to be producing the egg, as being tall because she grows tall. And her alleles are going to be a capital A and a capital A, or big A, big A. The father pea plant, which is going to be producing the pollen and the sperm cells, we're going to call this guy short because he doesn't grow very tall, and his alleles are going to be little a, his pair, so to speak. So you notice each parent has a pair of alleles that's controlling how tall they grow. Now, Mendel figured out that some traits are dominant and some traits are recessive, and he noticed that if you cross a purebred tall pea plant, big A, with a purebred short plant represented by little a alleles, then 100% or all the offspring are going to be just as tall as this purebred parent. And he named these offspring hybrids because they're different. Their alleles are big A, or one of each of the alleles that the parents originally had. You can express this law as saying that a dominant trait is a trait that will always show in the hybrid. For example, this big A, individual is always tall, not medium short, not short, but tall, just as tall as one of the parents. The recessive trait hides or is hidden by the dominant trait. So in this hybrid, big A, the shortness, the recessiveness of the short parent is completely out of view. It's not showing. Now, if we cross, here's what we just talked about represented as a picture. If we cross a purebred tall pea plant with a purebred short pea plant, all the offspring we get are going to be big A, little a. Another way of describing this first generation of offspring is to call them the F1 generation. And you'll notice that their alleles are big A, little a. Mendel also figured out something called the law of segregation. And you can state Mendel's law of segregation by saying that parental alleles must separate and they cannot be inherited together. Now, the easiest way to see this is in a Punnett square. And you probably have heard of Punnett squares, but remember, I'm pretending you don't know anything about them. A Punnett square is a series of boxes, and each box represents a potential outcome or a possible outcome for offspring. So in the case of this Punnett square here, we have 4 possible outcomes. So each box represents 25% of future generations. So let's do some crosses here. In this first cross, we're going to cross a big A individual with a little a individual. So according to Mendel's law of segregation, in this individual, these two alleles have to get away from each other. So they're going to separate. They could be egg cells or sperm cells. And this individual's alleles are going to have to separate also into a single little a and a single little a. Now these are potential gametes. These could be egg or sperm, and these could be egg or sperm. And we're going to need to combine one of each to make the future generation. So notice that these alleles are now separated, and they're segregated when eggs or sperm cells are made. Now let's see if we can make a Punnett square from these. We're going to take these two gametes, either egg or sperm, it doesn't matter, and we're going to put them here along the side, and we're going to take these two gametes here and put them across the top. So you label the rows and the columns in a Punnett square with the potential gametes of the parents. And then if we fill it in, just matching them up, we get all of the potential offspring, all 4 of them in the middle here, being big A, little a. So that means that our results, or a summary of our results from this cross, would be 100% of the offspring are going to be hybrid tall. That's the only thing you can get. And this is what Mendel saw in his crosses and what he called his law of dominance. Let's do another cross. Let's cross 2 hybrids, a big A, little a, crossed with a big A, little a. These are both 2 tall pea plants, but they're tall in a different way genetically than a purebred tall. They're not purebred. These are what we call hybrid. So just like we did before, we're going to segregate the alleles. They have to get away from each other. Okay, these again are separated egg cells and sperm cells. We're going to use them to label the columns and the rows of a Punnett square, and then we're going to fill in our Punnett square. You notice we get some different results here. Okay, we get 25% of the potential offspring as being big A, 50% big A, little a, and 25% little a, little a. Now we can summarize this even further because we know big A, and big A, little a are both going to be tall because tall is dominant to short. So we can combine those 2 results into one and say 75% of the pea plants are going to be tall and 25% are predicted to be short. Okay? Oops, that's a typo. That right here should not be tall, that should be short. I'll fix that in a minute. All right, let's do our last cross here. We're going to cross a hybrid tall with a purebred short, just like we did before, separating the alleles into potential gametes, using these gametes to label the rows and columns of a Punnett square, filling in the Punnett square, and notice here we get a 3rd possible set of results here. 50% are big A, little a, and 50% are little a, little a. So we got a 50% tall and 50% short. Now we got some vocabulary to make sure we know how to use accurately when we're talking about genetics. The genotype of an organism is the actual letters you see that represent that organism. For example, big A, little a is an example of a genotype. A phenotype tells you what the organism looks like or what trait they are displaying. For example, a big A, little a individual would be tall, not short. And the genotype always determines the phenotype. So if you know an individual is big A, little a, and you know big A is a dominant trait and little a is a recessive trait, then because you know the genotype, you can immediately figure out the phenotype. So this individual is going to have to be tall because tall is dominant to short. Homozygous genotypes are also known as pure breeding genotypes. For example, big A, and little a, little a. Heterozygous genotypes have different letters. Hetero carries with it the meaning different. And these genotypes are also known as hybrids, such as big A, little a. Okay, when you're expressing results from Punnett squares, you can either use percentages, like we've already used, or you can express your results as ratios, 3 to 1. So a 75% tall to 25% short could also be just as accurately described as a ratio of 3 tall to 1 short, or 3:1. I'm quite sure most of you guys have done ratios in math at some point. And just remember, these results are a prediction of possible offspring in the future. All right, that's going to end our slideshow, and we'll pick up at the next benchmark on the next